Hello and welcome to another Digital Photo Mentor Live, the #1 place on the internet to learn how to edit photos using Lightroom, Photoshop, and Luminar AI and have some fun while we work. My name is Darlene from digitalphotomentor.com, and today I'm going to be editing reader and subscriber images using my approach and my editing techniques. I'll edit the photos as if they were my own, and you'll see how to fix or improve a photo or just edit it to my tastes. In some cases, I'm actually going to give some photography tips as well if I feel like the photo could use some work in camera before working on it in the editing process. If you would like to see how I edit your images, just fill out the form to upload your images and answer a few questions. It's in the link below the video, in the description below the video. You can also submit a question and I'll try and answer it either here in the Q&A section, or if we have enough questions about photo editing, I'll do a separate live just to answer those. So without further ado, let me set some things up here to get started. Okay, where's everybody? I'm not seeing the chat, Rob. Let me just go and check out. I've got the chat set up correctly. Tell me if you're just joining in for the first time. Just say new in the chat, and I'd love it if you would say that in the description of the video as well, because then I can welcome you if you're new to the channel. So let me just
Equity Health Services.
Grab the chat here. There we go. Okay, I got Kelowna, Vancouver, Alaska, Rick from St. Albert, Mike. Excellent. All right. So I'm going to be using Lightroom and Luminar AI as a standalone and a plugin for Lightroom and Photoshop today. If you've not used Luminar AI before, you'll get to see how it works and you can decide if you want to give it a try. We do have a 5-day editing challenge, which is at digitalphotomentor.com. Rob will post it in the chat for you. If you want to sign up, you get my images to edit and a trial version of Luminar to give it a go. And then if you decide to purchase it, you can use our code digitalphotomentor to get $10 off. Okay, so unlike Adobe products, it's a one-time purchase and you can use it as a plugin for Lightroom and Photoshop. And I'm going to show you examples of both today as well. So if you enjoy this lesson today and this live editing, please remember to like it and subscribe to the channel because it will help us reach more people and help more people with their photo editing. So let me get over to screen sharing and show you some of the images that I'm going to be working on today. Here we go. All right. Can everybody see? You should be able to see Luminar right now. I'm just going to flip over to Lightroom. Does everybody see my Lightroom? There's probably a slight delay. So first thing I'm going to show you is a quick before and after from an image from Tom Murphy. And I showed the before and after last week, but I didn't show the editing. So I promised him he would be first up. So we're going to do this one first. And I'll show you how I took it from this, which was his original. Actually, let me go to uncrop it. I'm just going to go all the way back to the beginning. Okay, so that's his original image, uncropped, and that was what I finished up with after I edited it in Lightroom and Luminar. So I'll show you the steps on this one on what I did to create that. So the first thing I did, and I get a lot of questions about how do I decide what to do to an image or where to start. So the first thing that I looked at when I saw this image was that it has a lot of foreground, and I wanted to crop some of that off. So when you have a lot of foreground in this image, or in any image, it feels like the subject is really far away. Okay, you could see that a third of the image is water, and there's not really anything there to hold the eye, or there's no subject matter. So I want to crop that out. And the sky itself is sort of washed out and white because it was a very overcast day. So immediately I thought of doing a sky replacement. Okay, so a couple of things I'm going to do before I do the cropping. I want to do some corrections. Okay, so inside the crop tool in Lightroom, and there's a similar tool in Luminar as well. So just open the crop tool, and you can do that from this little button right here, or just press R on your keyboard. Okay, and there's a little thing here that says auto. Okay, so if you click auto, what it's going to do is trying to correct the image in terms of if it's crooked. Okay, so I clicked it, and you can see that it corrected it a little bit. Okay, I'm going to grab the bottom handle now, and I'm going to just free adjust the image, and I'm not worrying so much about the aspect ratio or keeping it the same. Okay, because if I had locked it with the original aspect ratio, right, it's going to crop like this. Okay, so I don't want to crop like that. I want a free crop. So I unlock it and just come up from the bottom. So I don't need so much water. And I don't like this sort of whatever this thing is over on the right. So I decided to crop that out as well. Now, when you're in the crop tool in Lightroom, if you just put your mouse over the corner, you'll see these little sort of two arrows, and then you can rotate as well. Okay, so if I didn't quite get it straight, I can rotate it a bit more. But I'm going to go and do one more thing, and I'll show you that in a different tool. So then just hit Enter to apply that crop. Okay. Scrolling down in Lightroom, and I showed this last week, but if you missed it, right, I use what's called solo mode in Lightroom. So if you just click on any of these menus, just click on the bar itself, right click, and make sure that solo mode is checked off. What that means is that when I open another one of these little tabs, it closes the previous one. Okay, so you can see that it's not opening them all at the same time, and it just makes it easier, especially if you're working on a laptop where you don't have a lot of real estate, you can only see the one thing at a time. So I don't have to scroll up to see the tools, right? So the one I'm looking at now is the transform tool. The transform is going to do things like correct distortion, in this case for the buildings. Okay, so there's a few options. I can hit auto and see what it does, and I usually start with that one. So you can see it kind of stretched out the buildings a little bit. I'll just turn it off. Okay, if I try level, okay, you can see that it corrected the horizon tilt, and it's looking for horizon, and also the verticals are straight vertical and not tilted. Okay. Vertical means that it's trying to correct vertical distortion. So if you're looking up at something or down at something, your buildings will start converging, and it will be more obvious the wider the lens that you use. Okay, so you can see that when I click that, it did do something. Right, I'm just going to turn all this off and try full. Okay, and see what it does. So it's also correcting sort of the perspective. So if I turn this little toggle off here, so any of these tools or these sections in Lightroom, you can just toggle it off. Okay, so you see what that's doing is it's really correcting the distortion or perspective to keep those buildings straight. Okay, now if you're not an architectural photographer and you're not concerned about that, maybe you don't want to use that. But in this case, I think it's doing a nice job. Great. The next thing I'm going to do is go back to my basic panel. Oh, one more correction, sorry. I'm always going to make sure that I turn off chromatic aberration. And I'm just going to zoom in here, actually maybe even to 200%. And I want to see what I'm looking for. When I talk about chromatic aberration, what that means is that there is a color fringe. Okay, so chromatic aberration occurs when your lens doesn't focus the red, the green, and the blue layers of the image at the same place. So you'll often see a green or a red outline around things. Okay, so you can see a little bit of green on the edges of these buildings. Just, it's really subtle. But if I just, sorry, let me untick it. Okay, now let's have a look. There's not a lot there. There's a little bit of purple here. Okay, can you see that purple along the edge there? Let me go to the other side. And where it usually occurs is on the edges of the images. So you'll see it especially with a wide angle lens. It's not too prominent here. There's a little bit of purple there next to the chimney. But when I check that off, you'll see that it mostly removes it. You can also do it manually and click this little eyedropper and look for, see the purple there, and remove the purple. Okay, do you see what that just did? So that's the defringe that I used here, and I just clicked this eyedropper and clicked it on the purple. Okay, so see what that's doing is it's getting rid of that that edge color, that purple that's there. And when you have chromatic aberration, it actually lowers the sharpness of your image overall. So I like to include that on every image that I edit. If you're using Lightroom, you can also actually set it up as an import preset so that when you import your images, you can automatically apply chromatic aberration, and it's just as simple as that tick box. Okay, so you don't have to worry about it when you import your images. It's done automatically for you. The next thing that I'm looking at is the histogram, and I talked a bit about this last week. Rob, maybe you can share the image, the article about when your snow is gray. It talks about reading the histogram and understanding the histogram. When you're shooting, you want to pay attention to the histogram so that nothing is clipping or off the graph. Now I'm going to do clipping to show you what that looks like, and if you're in the camera, you'll see things that may be flashing at you. Okay, if you have the highlight warning turned on, which I recommend, right? So where you see red here, that means that the sky is now clipped with no detail. Okay, and because this is a JPEG, if this was the way it came out of camera, that would be really difficult to recover. And you see that by a spike on the histogram up the right hand side. Okay, let me just undo that. Okay, so you can see that there's nothing clipping here, but what the histogram is telling me is that there's lots of really bright areas, right? And that is the sky. So I'm going to turn down the highlights, because the highlights are the areas that are just below white. And if you look at the histogram while my mouse is hovered over highlights, over the slider, you can see that it's not quite all the way to the right side of the histogram. It's a little bit in. Okay, so when I put my mouse up here, that's the section I'm affecting with highlights. So when I drag this down, okay, see what happens to the sky? I've picked up a lot of detail there, okay, or a little bit of detail there, but there's not much to get in the beginning. So I'm actually going to do a sky replacement, and that needs Luminar to do that. Okay. Before I leave Lightroom, I'm just going to do my little trick again with the whites and the blacks. So hold the shift key, double click the word blacks, and what will happen is it will put the blacks to touch the edge of the graph, okay? Because before there was no blacks, and now we have some actually clipping. If you hold the Alt Option key down and click the slider, you'll see what's clipping as you drag the slider, and you'll see the colors appear. With white, you don't want to clip. With black, you do. Because when you have some black clipping, it actually increases the contrast overall and the saturation of your image. I'll show you that in a second. I'm going to do the same on the whites. Now see that it popped the whites up higher. Because I turned down the highlights, you have to be careful of when you pull the highlights all the way down that you end up making something that looks very flat. Okay, so when I pull the highlights down in the sky, it's affecting the entire image. That's what's called a global edit. Okay, so you have to be careful that you're pulling the highlights down in the sky, but you're doing it in the overall image and flattening it as well. Okay, so if you do that, just make sure that you also check your whites to make sure that you have the contrast put back. Okay, and I'm not going to clip the highlights so much because I'm going to replace that sky. Okay, so let's just take a look at the before and after. Okay, so I'm just using the backslash key. So it's not going all the way back to the uncropped image. Okay, so before and after, I've added a bit of punch, and you can see that there's some more contrast. I might bring the shadows up a little bit, or even the exposure a little bit, just to bring up some detail in those buildings. And now I'm just about ready to hop over to Luminar. Okay, so I'm going to leave it here. One thing I might do is just add a graduated filter to darken the water a little bit. Okay, if you add a graduated filter, I use the keyboard shortcut M. Okay, and you see some weird things happening, like here it's yellow. Okay, so what it's doing is it's applying whatever you did last. Okay, it remembers your settings. So if you don't want those, just double click Effect. And in this case, I want to darken the water, so I'm just going to go exposure, a little bit darker. Okay, if you want it to fade more gradually, spread the lines apart farther. Okay, so it's going to fade from there to there. Let me just show you what happens if I make the fade narrow. Okay, so if I make the fade narrow, you get almost a hard line. If you make the fade wider, okay, you can see that it's now more gradual. Okay, so I do these edits to extreme in this example because you can see it easier. Okay, And if you're not sure what something's doing, that's a great idea in your own practice. Take a slider all the way to one end and then all the way to the other end just to see what it does. Okay. I might apply a slight preset here. So I've got a set of presets. Rob, if you could pop the link in for those. These are Lightroom presets. So if you're using Lightroom, I have a few things set up, like to add edge vignettes, increase the tonal contrast, denoise and things like that, and skin tones. So if you're interested in Lightroom presets, I have a few for you. So I'm going to add a slight edge vignette. Now we're ready to pop over to Luminar. Okay, so there's a couple of ways that you can do that. I'm going to go directly from here to Luminar, but you can also open in Photoshop as well. So to do that, you have to go right click, right, and export it to Photoshop. Edit a copy with Lightroom adjustments. Okay, so I can export to Luminar directly, okay, or I can edit in Photoshop as a smart object. Okay, so if I edit in Photoshop as a smart object, if you're used to using Photoshop, I would recommend that workflow. Then apply Luminar as a smart filter. Then save the whole thing and it will come back into Lightroom. I'll do another tutorial about just that procedure as a tutorial. Okay, but for today, I'm going to go edit in Luminar AI. Okay. So what it's going to do is it's going to ask me, do I want to edit with Lightroom adjustments? Yes, I do, because of the things that I've already done. So I want to start from there, okay? I'm going to edit a TIFF, which is a nice high resolution file with 16 bits. So I'm always working in the highest resolution and the most amount of color and information that I can. Okay, and Adobe RGB is a larger color space. Okay, these are in order of the amounts of colors. So the higher you go, the more quality you have. You have to keep in mind that you also need a computer with the processing power to handle these things, right? So now I'm going to see it open this image in Luminar. I'm just going to pop over here and see if there's any questions about anything. My video feed looks poor. Rob, can you confirm that the video looks okay? Okay, so Lightroom Luminar has now opened. Just have to drag it over here. All right, so now the image is open inside of Luminar. And what I want to do, I know that I want to do a sky replacement. Okay, so I'm just going to hop straight over to edits, and I'm not going to use a template. I might do Enhance AI, come back to that one after, because Enhance AI is a great tool. Look what it does just by sliding that one slider. It's picking up the sky and it's enhancing all these great colors in the building. So actually that did a really nice job, but I'm going to come back to that one later. You'll also notice that there's some weird things happening in the sky here, okay? This is because I'm starting with a JPEG, not the raw file. So if you have a raw file to start with, you'll get a lot less of this sort of pixelation the further you pull your image, right? So if you have a JPEG, you have to really be careful of taking it too far and watch for those pixelation things, especially in the sky, okay? So I'm going to pull the Accent AI up a little bit, and we'll come back to that one after I do the sky. So Sky AI is under the Creative section, and I'm going to look for a sky that I think is going to complement this one. And the one that I had used is actually in our set of sky replacements, our DPM skies. So if you want to pop that in, Rob. The newest version of Luminar AI also does reflections, and you now have thumbnails showing the skies. Okay, so the one that I want, I have to find it. I think it's this one, maybe. So I'm trying to find the same one that I used before. Might be this one. And then it just pops the sky in. Nope, that's not the right one. Sorry, pop in the link to our sky pack, Rob. Okay, so this is the one that I used in the example before and after. Okay, so this is one in my sky pack. And what happens is when you put it in, it does some automated things. So AI is artificial intelligence, okay? So it's looking for where are the edges of things, and you can see that it's done a pretty good job filling it in between the sky and so on, but you can adjust those as well. Okay, so you can adjust the mask refinement using the tools inside Sky AI. If you want it to cover more, slide up the global. But what happens when you do global, you'll see that it's now coming over into the rooftops, okay? So global means it's covering more things. So if you had sky clouds in the original sky, it would actually try and write over them. So I don't want to increase the global here because it's writing over the rooftops, okay? So keep that at a level where it's nice and filled in. If the trees have some gaps, you can use this slider to fill in some of the gaps, right? And it does a nice job filling in between the branches. Does a really good job. Okay? And I'm happy with that. So I'm going to go back to orientation, which is the one at the top here. Okay? Orientation allows you to blend the horizon, and I'm just going to show you what that looks like. Okay, so if I move the sky image up, you can see now where the edge of the new sky ends and the original sky begins. Okay, so horizon blending is that same thing that I talked about with the graduated filter. It's how well does that sky blend in. So if I increase the blend, it's like fading that sky out. Okay, can you see that? So it just makes it a softer edge. Right? Versus if I have zero blending, you can see the hard edge of the sky. Okay, so default, it leaves it at 50. And vertical offset, you can see that you can move the sky up and down. Okay, so I moved it up just to show you. But you can also see that it's done a pretty good job. I might move it down just a little bit, right, to kind of fill in this gap here and maybe just blend it a little bit more. Okay. I'm fairly happy with that. Horizon or horizontal offset moves the sky left and right. Right? So if I want more of that orange cloud, I can move it this way. Or if I want more of the pink clouds, I can move it that way. So you can play around with the positioning. I kind of like the clouds like that. It looks very dramatic. You can also rotate. So if your horizon is not straight and you want it that way, you can rotate the sky as well. That's new. And flip it. Okay, so when you're choosing a sky, you want to make sure that you choose a sky that is appropriate for the image. Okay, this one, the light on the buildings is fairly flat and non-directional, so you don't want to pick a sky that has the bright sun because it's not going to match. Okay, if you have a cloudy sky and a cloudy foreground, those are going to match better. This one I can get away with because I'm going to use the relight sliders down here. And it will match the foreground better to the sky once I do that. Okay. So down here under sky relighting, scene relighting. So relight strength, I'm going to take it all the way, applies to the foreground. So see as I dial it up, it now makes that scene look like it was shot with this sky. Okay, so it matches a lot better, including the saturation. Okay. If there is a person, you would use the relight human slider, but we don't have any people here. So I'm going to take this one not quite as far, but I like what it's doing to the overall image. It's making it more like it's a sunset picture. Okay. You can also affect the reflection in terms of amount of reflection. And you could see that it's picking up the color down here. And you'll notice that if I flip the sky, it changes the color to over here. Okay, so it knows that there's ripples in the water, but it's reflecting that color in the appropriate places. Okay. So I'm going to leave the reflection fairly high. You can also defocus the sky or add some grain. Okay, so if your original image is grainy, you can add a bit of grain. The one that I use a fair bit is this atmospheric haze slider. So taking it all the way up, what it does is it kind of adds this softening effect to the sky and makes it less saturated and less contrasty, as if there was haze on the horizon. Okay, so by taking that up, I lower the intensity of that really bright color. And I think that works really well for this image because I don't want to have super saturated colors in the sky and not in the buildings. Okay, so I'm going to leave that haze up a little bit. And you can also adjust the brightness of the sky. Okay, maybe brighten it up a little bit. And the warmth, so I can decide to make it more yellow or go to the more blue side. Blue actually works well because of this pink here, and I think it works nicely. So really, I'm just playing around with the sliders to make it fit this image. And you'll notice that as I play with this, I'm going to turn the relight sliders up. You'll notice that as I play with the brightness of the sky, it's affecting the foreground as well because I'm doing the relight. Right? Same thing with the atmospheric the haze. All right, so I think originally I had processed it a bit more contrasty, like something like that. So each time you do this, it could come out a little bit different, right? I've gone a little bit more blue. Originally, I think I went a little bit more on the yellow side, okay? Let's do something like that. Okay, now that I've got the sky in place, I can go back to that Accent AI at the very top. And there's a sky enhancer slider here as well. Okay, so if you have a good sky to begin with, use this slider. And I'll show you that on another image. See what it does is it really punches up the contrast and saturation of the sky itself. Okay, you have to be careful not to overdo it because the sky can get oversaturated really quickly. So play with the Accent AI a little bit. That's brightening up the foreground. And let's go a little bit on the sky enhancer. So let's take a before and after. You can do that in Luminar with this little toggle here. So I can see what I pulled from Lightroom over to Luminar, right? And that's literally just two tools. I've used the Accent AI and the sky replacement. One other thing I'm going to add to this image is a mood tool. And this one is what's called a LUT, okay? I'm gonna increase the amount and I'm going to choose a LUT. So LUT stands for look up table, which means it's like a color gradation or a cinematic grading to your image. And as you move your mouse over them, you can see a preview on the image. So I'm going to pick one that sort of helps the sky blend in a bit more with the original image. Now I know that some of the ones I used were down here. This one kind of gives it an older look, which is fitting for the scene. And Thomas said that this is Amsterdam, so it kind of gives it that old world look. This one looks kind of cool as well, sort of a brown almost tone. And then you can affect the amount of how much toning you're doing. Okay, so ever so subtle, right? It's just giving that little bit of toning to make them match a little bit because it's toning the sky and the foreground equally. Okay. Another favorite tool of mine inside of Luminar is Super Contrast down in the professional tools. Oh, and remember I told you that the Luminar has the same tools. Okay, so defringe is under here. And if you had the raw file, you'd also see chromatic aberration here. Okay, it only applies that to raw files. So Super Contrast is one that I use a lot, and it does a great job of sort of controlling the tones in the highlights, midtones, and shadows separately. So what I do is I take the highlight contrast up to sort of the middle, and then play with the balance, okay? So you'll see that if I go to the right, it's darkening the highlights, and to the left, it's brightening them. So I'm looking at this sky part in particular, because I want to darken that a little bit, but not too much. Right, so I get the amount sort of where I want dialed in and then just soften it a bit. So what I'm really looking to do is bring this highlight down in this area. And the cool thing about Luminar is that I can apply this as a local adjustment, meaning only to that area. Right? I want to apply some mid-tone contrast. And look what happens to the buildings. They really do a nice punch up when I apply this one. Okay, so I can brighten the midtones like so, and that helps them to match the sky a little bit better. Okay, like so. So now I can actually even brush this in to just certain areas. Okay, so let's say I want to just apply this to that area here on the sky. Okay, you can see that applying, and all the way across here. Okay, now I'm going to show you another little trick here that's cool, because even though Luminar doesn't have layers, it kind of does. Okay, so I can layer effects using the local adjustment tool. Okay, so what's happening is the mid-tone adjustment that I applied for the buildings, which looks great. Okay, see how it's punching the buildings up. See how it's doing that nice job here. It's making the sky too bright. Okay, so what I'm going to do is go back to the mask, and I'm going to not apply it onto the sky. I'm just going to apply it to the buildings. Okay, keep that nice and clean. Okay, so you can see that it's done a nice job there. But now I want to apply the highlight thing to the sky. So what I'm going to do is go up here to this little brush on the right, local masking. I'm going to add basic adjustments. And I'm going to bring the highlights down and possibly even the exposure. So what I can do with this one, even maybe the contrast, is it's affecting the whole image, but it's meant to be masked. Okay, so I'm going to mask this part just into the sky, right, ever so slightly. Oops, see, I made a boo-boo. So I did erase, meaning I'm erasing the effect from there instead of paint. So undo my boo-boo. Okay, and that was just Command Z or Z, and I'm going to paint into the sky. Okay, so I paint when I'm using an area that I want to apply that's smaller. And you can see that the cloud has been affected in not a good way. So I'm just going to undo that here. So it's totally what's called non-destructive editing. So I can apply as many of these things as I want, and I can go back and edit them. However, okay, remember how I opened this from Lightroom? When you open it from Lightroom into Luminar directly, once I save this by hitting the apply button, and I'll show you that in a moment, once I hit apply, it's not going to let me edit it again in Luminar with these same tools. Okay, so let me get out of the local masking. So once I hit apply, all of these things that I just did here are going to be cooked into this image and bring it into Lightroom as a new edited image. Okay? So if I want to do anything else in Luminar, I have to bring it back, but these edits will not be adjustable anymore. If you want to be able to come back to the same point and edit it again, that's where you need that Photoshop step in the middle, okay? Or open the image from Photoshop into Luminar as a plugin. One more thing I'm going to add here is the dramatic filter. Okay, so dramatic increases the local contrast. Again, I'm just showing you what it does to an extreme. It kind of gives it a faded out look. But I want to really apply this to the buildings because I want to punch them up a little bit. Maybe not so much brightness, and keep the saturation there. Okay, so again, I can apply these and paint it in to just the buildings. Changing the size of the brush, right? You can do that here in terms of radius and softness, or I'm using the square bracket keys on my keyboard just to make it bigger and smaller, and holding shift to change that fade. Okay, so there's two circles, just like there was a fade on the graduated filter. Same thing on this one when you're brushing it in. Okay, so it just keeps the edge a bit softer. So all I want to do is punch up the contrast in the buildings like this. Okay, now let's do another before and after. Okay, so you can see what's happening. So I think I've actually done a better job editing this sky and this one than I did the first time because it looks more natural and believable. Okay. If you're happy with your edits, you can actually save it as a template as well. The only thing you want to be careful of saving a template when you've done lots of sort of local adjustments like this, it will save those things too. Okay, so if you've painted in masks on things, it's going to apply those to the next image when you use that template as well. So generally, if I'm saving a template, I do so without any of those masking tools applied. I'm going to hit apply now, and you can see that it's processing, and it's going to hop back over to Lightroom. So let me just check over in the chat and see if there's any questions. Can sky resolution be less than the main image, or does it have to be the same? The sky will be scaled, but that actually creates a problem, Mike, because if you scale the sky, if your original image is not grainy, your sky might be, okay? So they won't match. So you do want to make sure that your sky images are high resolution, at least equal, especially if you're doing the repositioning that I showed, because that sort of stretches it as well. So you want to make sure that you have a good high resolution sky image, okay? Good question. All right, so let's go back to Lightroom, and now you can see that I've got a new image. I'm just going to drag it up here to be with these other ones. So now I've got three versions, okay? So the original version that came out of Lightroom, the one I just did, and the original one. So you can see that the one I did previously, or last week, I made much more darker and moodier, and this new one I made lighter and airier and softer, more pastel colors, right? So the editing is totally up to you. I used the same sky replacement in both and got a totally different look. Okay, I think I used a different color, mood or LUT to on this one and went with a darkened look. Okay, so I'm actually going to go over to Tom's question because he actually asked me some questions about this. So he said that he was actually going to return Luminar AI. Seemed that the system was only about sky replacements and doesn't shoot a lot of skies. So he's watched the replay and had no idea of the depth and breadth of the options available. Yes. So I hope that gives you even a better idea, Tom, of what you can do with the program. How do I learn about editing, he says. If you don't know very much, well, tune in every week. So this is what we're doing. I'm going to be doing this every week. You can continue to submit your images, and I'll try to edit a variety of people's images so it's not the same people every week. So if you have submitted an image that I've already edited, you know, I may not do yours the next week, and it may be the following week. So keep those images coming in so we can keep doing this every week. Yes, you can use Lightroom and Luminar as a plugin for Lightroom. So if you've already put your images in Lightroom, Tom, you can use Luminar as a plugin, and it's actually really easy to do that. When you first get Luminar, I'll just hop over here. You just go to Install Plugins, and it will actually show you, it'll find Photoshop and Lightroom, and all you have to do is click Install. It's that simple. Okay, then if you've already had Lightroom launched, close it, relaunch it, and you'll be able to see it as a plugin like what I just did. Okay. If you're not shooting RAW, or if you're shooting both, in Lightroom you have a choice of how the images display. Okay, so let me show you that, Tom. So when you are in Lightroom, go to your preferences, and you're going to see how to handle, if you can see this one here, right? Treat JPEG files next to RAW files as separate photos. Okay, so I have that checked off because I don't shoot RAW plus JPEG at the same time. If you do, you probably want to untick that. So what will happen is it'll do exactly what you described, Tom. It'll have them stacked in Lightroom. You'll see that it says RAW plus JPEG. So just make sure that you are editing the RAW file, not the JPEG. And the reason that I would recommend that as stacking them, because if you rename anything, if you have RAW and JPEG and you treat them as separate files, you'll end up with, for example, if you've shot 5 images, but 2 of each, RAW and JPEG, you'll have 10 files. If you rename them and treat them separately, you'll end up numbering them 1 through 10. Okay, so the JPEG and the RAW that are actually the same image will get numbered differently. Okay, so that could be a problem. Let's see. So I think that covers his questions. Anybody else have any questions before I move on? Holly says, so editing a JPEG is acceptable, just not preferred. Yes, ideally. So you saw what happened when I tried to pull the sky really far. And I've got some other examples of that as well, which I'm going to come up to in the sunset here right away. So yes, you can edit a JPEG, you just can't take it as far, and I'll show you that. So yes, all is not lost. Deb says, since the last Lightroom update, when I go to edit in Luminar, it opens, but there's no templates and the edit panel is not there. Deb, maybe if you could email me and send me a screenshot of what's happening, I can try and help you see what's going on there. If we can't figure it out, you may have to talk to support. I'm not sure, maybe the plugin's not installed correctly or something, but you should see those things. Yeah, for sure. Richard, yes, please do submit some images. The latest version of Photoshop does not allow plugins for Macs with the M1 chip. Unfortunately, yeah, there's a lot of issues with M1 computers and photo editing software, and it's just a matter of the Adobe even has to catch up with Apple. So whenever the hardware manufacturers come out with a new operating system or the camera manufacturers come out with a new raw file, they all have to communicate together and figure out how to make it work in the software. So they're probably in the process of doing that. Unfortunately, it's just going to take a while. So yeah, M1s are not fully working right now. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Okay, I'm going to come back to these because I want to show templates. So I want to get through some of these here that I'm going to talk about fairly quickly. Rob, this one, if you could share getting sharper images. So I've got this image on the screen because I want to show you, I can't do a lot of editing here, and it's a fairly, you know, it's an image that's okay, but I would recommend that you go back and change some of your settings. I think this, yeah, this is Bill's image. Okay, so the reason that I recommend that is, I'm just going to zoom in here. This is 200%. I want to look at the little bird's face. Okay, can you see how it's sort of blurry and it looks like there's like a double image? Okay, that's an indication of a couple of things. There's either camera shake from holding the camera not still enough, or a combination of camera shake and subject movement. Okay, when you're photographing a moving target like birds, you want to have a fast shutter speed, and you want to follow what's called the reciprocal rule. Okay, so that's in that Getting Sharper Images article that Rob has just shared in the chat. Okay, so you want to be your shutter speed 1 over the focal length of the lens, or faster. So in this case, that's 200 millimeters, and the shutter speed is only 1 over 160. Okay, so that's part of the problem. The other problem is that the birds are moving. Okay, so how you could have done that here is, you've got a 2.8 lens. You could have opened your aperture at least another stop, maybe more. Okay, to 2.8. If you don't want 2.8, go to f4, so you could get almost another stop of light there. And you could also increase your ISO. Okay, so if you'd increased your aperture a stop and your ISO a stop, okay, so now you're going to be shooting at about f3.5, ISO 640. Your shutter speed is going to be about 1 over 640. You'll get a much sharper image because of that. Okay, so don't worry so much about depth of field. Use the focus settings that are in your camera correctly. And I'm going to look at what camera he's using here. I do believe it was a Nikon. Let me just do that. Yes, Nikon 850, D850. So yes, that's a full frame camera. Okay, so you should be able to use a faster shutter speed and get a sharper image, and your camera's got really high quality. Okay. In terms of editing this image, the same thing would apply here as the one I did before. There's lots of foreground, okay, so I want to get rid of that so I feel closer to the birds now. And then there's just a lot of everything. So I know you couldn't do anything in terms of shooting it tighter, okay, because you don't have a longer lens. That was the max. And then maybe just get them a little bit off center. Okay. So I'm going to get rid of some of the top and bottom and put these birds maybe a little bit off center. And keep in mind that you don't have to have an image that is a particular aspect ratio, especially if you're sharing it on social media. Okay? I would do my little blacks and whites trick, double click, and you can see that immediately it adds more contrast and saturation. And because the subject is now off center, I'm not going to use the vignette that's down in here, because when you vignette from here, it always goes from the edges into the center, okay, as the post-crop vignette. So I'm going to use a radial filter. Okay, so a radial filter is a similar kind of idea. Okay, I'm going to double click. I want to darken. Now you're going to see what happens when I click this here, and it's going to add a circle. And I can place it wherever I want around the birds. But it's doing the darkening inside the circle, so I'm going to invert it with this little checkbox. Okay. Then I can adjust the positioning, and I go extra dark on purpose, again, to see where it's going, and then just dial it back. Okay, so one thing you don't want to do with any type of vignette is you don't want to do that. Okay, you don't want to make it really obvious. Okay, you want to keep the feather soft, and you want to keep the adjustments a little bit more subtle. Okay, so let's just fade that out and maybe even make the circle a little bit bigger. So what that's doing is putting the attention on the birds as opposed to the outer edges. Okay, so I'm just going to show the before and after. Okay, so all that's doing is just bringing your attention into the center. So that's all I would really do with this image. I might tone the highlights in the water down a little bit more, but I would suggest if this is something that's near to you, go back and keep shooting this, especially in the spring. You're going to be getting some of these baby birds coming out soon. So go back to the pond and keep practicing. All right, let's move on to this one. I'm actually going to do this one in both Lightroom and Luminar. Okay, so this is an image by Larry, And he shot this with a power shot. Okay, so keep in mind that this is a fairly small camera, and it was shot at ISO 800. So this is like pretty much a point and shoot camera. And I'm going to zoom in here because what I want you to see is that it's very noisy. Okay, so when I talk about noise, let me just reset this. Okay, so this is the original. Can you see all of these grainy, speckly bits? Okay, and it also looks like it's sort of a checkerboard pattern. Okay, that's noise and pixelation. So I don't know if this is the original out of the camera or not. Let me see. Yeah, he's got some metadata, so probably is. When you shoot with a small sensor camera like this and a high ISO, you're going to get a fair bit of noise. Okay, so when you're shooting at night like this, the first thing you want to do is to use a tripod. Maybe Rob share a link to our night photography tips general category page, because I talk about camera settings for shooting at night, or some of our night articles where we talk about that. But if you don't have a tripod and you have to use a high ISO, you want to use some noise reduction. Okay, so the challenge with noise reduction is that I'm going to zoom into 100 here. As you apply the noise reduction, and you'll notice that the noise appears more in the dark areas than it does in the light areas. That's very common. Okay, so I'm going to put that here so we can see sort of all the different areas. The challenge with noise reduction is as you increase it, and I'm just going to take it all the way to the top, it's sort of looking for any speckles and just blurring them out. So overall, it sort of removes the sharpness of the image. Can you see that everything looks sort of blurry now that I've added the noise reduction? Okay, so if I crank it all the way up and then I say, oh, okay, I need to crank my sharpness up, right? Now you're sort of battling the two, because what happens now when you crank up the sharpness is you get these weird artifacts. Okay, can you see that? And again, this is because I'm editing a small JPEG from a small camera. It would be better from a RAW file, but you're still going to be getting some of these types of artifacts. Okay, so what you have to do, I'm just going to dial these down a little bit, is you have to have this little dance between increasing the noise reduction sliders, right, a little bit to get rid of the noise, and then increasing the sharpening so that you have sort of a balance between, yes, I've got rid of some of the noise, but I'm not over sharpening those artifacts. Okay. The other thing you want to do with the sharpening slider in Lightroom, and I'm just going to take it all the way up, is use this masking slider. If you're not sure what masking does, it's very similar to what I just did over in Luminar, where it's applying only to part of the image. Okay. The trick is you can't see it unless you push the Alt Option key. So when you push the Alt Option key and then click the masking slider, okay, what it's showing you now is the mask. Okay, a mask means white is showing everything. Okay, so white means that this effect, the sharpening, okay, and the noise reduction, specifically sharpening, is applying everywhere. So where you see white, that's where the sharpening is applying. Watch what happens as I hold the Alt key and drag this masking slider to the right. Okay, so I'm getting less and less white areas. Okay, so now you can see that the sharpening is not applying to the night sky, it's only applying to these areas. Okay, so now when I zoom in, you can see that it's applying the sharpening to the edge, but not this background area. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a copy of this, and I'm going to reset it because I want to do the same thing in Luminar, and let's see which one does a better job. Maybe share the article I have on denoise, Rob. Topaz has a product. Topaz has a product that is called denoise, and it does a really great job of removing noise. But it's a fairly expensive program. It's like $79 or something. Excuse me. And you have to send the image either to it from Lightroom or Photoshop and wait for it to do its thing. It takes a really long time. Okay, now my computer is slowing down. All right, so the first thing I'm just going to do is hop right over to Edit and go right to denoise. Okay, so I'm going to zoom in here so we can see that noise again. And I find that the Luminar denoise does a really great job, right? So if I take it all the way, it's going to give us that blur again. Okay, so let's take it part way. And in Luminar, if you're looking for a sharpen, that's under the details slider. Okay, and you have actually more control here than you do in Lightroom, because you can sharpen, okay, and you can mask just like you did in Lightroom. Okay, so I can sharpen and mask. But I can also increase the details of small, medium, and large details. And what I find is that when I use the small detail slider, you get more of that noise back because it's actually sharpening the noise, okay? If you have an image that's slightly out of focus, the small details can actually work well to sharpen the image. But let's bring up the medium details, okay? You can see where that's applying now, so not so much in the noise. Again, I'm doing this to see where it's applying, okay? So I'm going to use large details a little bit and medium details a little bit. And let's just look at the before. Okay, so you can see the noise after. Okay, so Luminar's doing a really good job getting rid of that noise in the background. Can you see the difference? While still maintaining the sharpness. Look at the original sharpness. That's the original sharpness. That's my sharpness after. Okay, I'm going to hit apply, and then we're going to compare this one to the one that I did in Lightroom. Because I find that Lightroom's noise reduction is not actually that great. If you want, you can do a little bit better in Photoshop, but it's basically the same engine. All right, let's compare. Where are we? Okay, so I think this is the one I've edited. Let me just check. Yes, okay, so this is the edited version in Lightroom. Sorry, this is the edited version in Lightroom. My tongue is not working, and I could tell this is the edited version in Luminar because it adds the suffix at the end of the file name. All right, let's zoom into that same area. Okay, we're at 200%, and I'm actually just going to do this. Okay, which is which? Okay, so the Luminar one's on the left. Okay, not too bad. When I zoom into 200%, I see a little more detail here. So I could probably go back and do a better job with the sliders in Luminar, but I think it's done a better job of the noise reduction without giving me those artifacts, okay? So I find that noise reduction is a really sort of, you have to play around a little bit and do that dance between sharpening and noise reduction to get a sharp image. Do I have some humans to edit? Well, you know, I would love that. So, Rajesh, please send me some, because I will go and show you what I've received, and I don't have a lot of people images. I've got one here with a little girl, but mostly these are what people are submitting. So, unfortunately, I don't have a lot of people images, and that's what I do a lot. So I would love to see some people images. So that could be street photography, travel photography, portraits, weddings, anything. So yes, absolutely. Please send me some people images. I would love to, right? So the only reason that you're seeing lots of landscape is that, yes, that's your Cuba photo, Anne. So the reason that I'm editing these is that's what I've got submitted. All right, let's go back to sunsets. Okay, I'm going to do sunsets, and then we're going to take a short intermission to do a bathroom break for a couple minutes. And I wanted to show you again the difference between a JPEG edit, especially when doing an extreme edit. Okay, so this is a JPEG from what kind of camera? Fuji FinePix. Whoops. Let's go back here. Okay, so JPEG from Fuji FinePix, again, a point-and-shoot camera, and shot at a low ISO, but because it's really underexposed and the contrast is so great, okay, you'll see that there's, if I look at the clipping, there's no detail in this part of the sky, okay, and if I zoom in, there's pretty much no detail there either. Okay, so what happens is if you try and increase the shadows and the highlights, you end up with a big sort of mess because you've got this weird color gradation here because there's no detail, and we've now created a lot of noise in this foreground area. Okay, so when you're trying to push an image like this to extremes, and you'll start to get things like this halo around the outside because I'm pulling the sky too far. Okay, so there's a halo, if you can see that, where there's a little white outline around everything. Okay, you don't want that. So what I did with this image was actually something different. Okay, so I'm going to show you what happens when I pull the highlights and shadows to extreme on a JPEG like this. Okay, versus if I do the same. Okay, now I'm just going to go to the next image, which is a raw file. Okay, so this is a raw file from a Fuji camera. And in Lightroom, if you click this little button here that says previous, any edits that I did on the last image are going to apply here as well. Okay, so you can see that I applied a crop, which apparently I had done as well, but look at the difference. Okay, so I applied the highlights minus 100, shadows plus 100 to really bring out those details. Let me just uncrop this here. Look at the difference. Look at how much detail I was able to pull out of this image, which is a raw file, right? And it's not super grainy at all, right? Because it's a raw file. And you can see that there's detail in the sky versus trying to do that same thing here with a JPEG that becomes a big mess, right? So I'm going to reset that one. And I'm going to show you how I'll finish this one off because there's a couple of things that I would do here on this image. When you're shooting a sunset, Rob, if you could please share the tips for shooting sunset, 3 sunset shooting tips. Thanks for sharing the link to submit that for Richard so he can send some images. So the first thing I want to look at again is composition. When I look at an image like this, I want to do my composition adjustment, and it's a little bit crooked, so I'm just going to try that auto again. Corrected it a little bit, but not really. So here I have a choice. When you're doing composition of a landscape like this, or any image in general, you want to use the rule of thirds as a starting point. And when you activate the crop tool in Lightroom, you see the grid for the rule of thirds. Okay, so it's like a checkerboard or a tic-tac-toe board. Okay, here the horizon is dead center in the image, which is kind of what you want to avoid. Okay, so you want to decide, is the land below the horizon more important, or is this about the sky? Now in this case it could be either. Okay, so I might actually decide that there's my image. Okay, and then I'm going to pull up some of the detail. And when you're doing a sunset like this, you might actually not need detail in the foreground. Okay, you don't always need to have detail everywhere. A silhouette sunset is perfectly acceptable. And I'm going to do my shift click tricks here again. Okay, so just quickly, by cropping and punching up the, let me lower that exposure, punching up the contrast a little bit, you can see what's happening here. Gives me a very dramatic image. Okay, now I can decide if I want to adjust the color, right? If I want more pink and then magenta, I'm going to go with those colors, versus if you want more red, go to the right, right? So a sunset like that with an almost silhouette of the bridge is perfectly acceptable. You don't have to have full detail everywhere. Okay. Similarly with this one, okay, this is a JPEG by Annie Adler, and I saw something similar, but this one worked really well with the crop tool to correct the tilt, because you see the horizon here is crooked. Okay, so when you're shooting a landscape and you see the horizon, you definitely want to make sure that that's straight. So there's a few different ways that you can do that. I showed you the tool inside the crop tool by clicking auto. So I'm going to click it, and now you can see that actually it did. If I go up here, you get more of these. You can see that it did a pretty good job. Yeah. Another way to do that is this little ruler. So I'm still in the crop tool. Click the ruler, and I get these little crosshairs now. So what I do is I put it on the beginning part of the horizon and drag it. So I'm clicking and holding my mouse, drag it to the other side of the horizon, and whatever the line is on, Lightroom's going to straighten it. Okay. There is one final way to do that, and that was back down here under the transform that we saw earlier, and that's using the level. Okay, so if I click level, you can see that it did the same thing. Okay, if If I go into my crop tool, you can see that it's now level. Okay, so the horizon here, you'll notice, is actually above the thirds. Okay, so I can decide, do I want to put it right on the thirds? Again, there's no steadfast rule that says you have to put the horizon right on the thirds. But if you want to go more panoramic with this image, I actually think it improves it. You don't necessarily need the beach. Okay, now you've got a leading line from the left, this wave here, leading you into the image, and then you sort of get over here and you wander around with the sky. Notice I haven't done any of the lighting adjustments or anything, and I think this is actually quite a strong image. I'm just going to adjust the highlights. Okay, so that's that Alt key again. Click Alt Option and the highlight slider and you'll see the clipping. Now I could pull this all the way down so that the sun isn't clipping, but guess what? The sun is a light source that's very bright, so it actually should be clipping. And that's one thing to consider when you're doing things like this. If you have the sun or like a light from a street light or something like that, you don't necessarily have to get rid of those clipping, because if you pull them down too far, right, you're going to end up with something muddy that looks incorrect. Okay, your eyes know that the sun is a light source and that it's bright. Okay, what I might do is actually darken the blacks. So I'm using that Alt key again. Okay, so it's showing me that part of that hill is clipping, but I don't need detail there. Let it go black. Okay, and I find that a lot of times beginners get really sort of overwhelmed with, okay, but I want to see the detail in the land, but you don't need to, right? This one, I might actually cool off or warm up. Let's warm it up a little bit. Let's really go with that orange, okay? Something like that, okay? So that's all I would do to this image, and it's that simple. Okay. Last sunset I'll cover, so we're doing all the sunsets at once, and I'm going to go back to that first one in Luminar. Okay, so this last sunset is from Larry again. So I actually wouldn't do this one. I wouldn't edit this one a lot. So there is a lot of detail because this is a raw file. Okay, so you can see how far I can actually pull this because it's a raw file and it's actually holding up fairly well. Okay, this is ISO, what is this? ISO 100. Okay, so it's holding up fairly well in terms of pulling this. So for this image, nice sunburst, okay, and that's because he shot it at f11. Okay, so when you're shooting into a light source and you have a light source like the sun or street light in your picture, if you shoot at f11 or smaller, f8 usually starting point, you'll start to get the light source turning into a starburst like this, and you'll notice that he's got the reflection having a starburst as well. So that's kind of cool. So you have to make a decision with this type of image. Do you want to go light and bright like this, or leave it on the dark side and let it be a silhouette? Okay, so if you're going to go dark, I would just leave the land dark like this, and I think I'm just going to make it a bit bluer so that sky is blue, and let's go darker on the landscape so we make a full silhouette. Okay, so I would do something like that for this image. And I also might do some lens corrections here, because what I'm seeing is as I darken it, can you see that the edge of the image overall is darker? So there's a bit of what's called lens vignette happening here, and you can fix that in the lens corrections. Okay, so enabling the lens profile. Okay, it doesn't recognize the lens, the 50mm 1.8. And what camera is he using? Nikon. Okay, so Nikon, let's see if it recognizes it. So Lightroom should recognize your lens, but if it doesn't, you may have to select it from the list. Okay, so I've just chosen Nikon and the 50mm lens there. And let's see what it's doing. Let's see if we have any chromatic aberration. No. Okay, so let's see what that lens correction is doing. It's removing some of the vignetting around the edge. Okay. Let's make sure I don't have any vignette there. No. Okay, so what it's doing is brightening this edge part here. Okay, and part of the vignette is happening because the sun is bright in the center. Okay, checking off that chromatic aberration just in case. So this would be a dark version of this image. You could actually process this a couple of ways. And what I did earlier, where I created what's called a virtual copy, that's easy to do in Lightroom. Okay, so you can right click and choose create virtual copy. where the keyboard shortcut is Command or Control apostrophe. So what that does is you'll see that I now have two images of this in Lightroom, two versions, okay, but it hasn't copied the original raw file. It's just made a new thumbnail for me to edit in a different way. So I'm actually going to reset it, and I'm still going to cool it off. And this one I'm going to do sort of more light and airy, right? So I'm going to brighten it up a little bit, and let's go with the flare. Okay? The flare I like. So let's do something like that. Okay. So now I have two versions. Oops. Somehow I've got it on my other screen. Okay, so now I have two versions, which I'll show you side by side. Okay, a dark version and a light version. Okay, so then when I go to export from Lightroom, okay, I can export them both. Right? So Lightroom is a catalog or a database system program so that all of the edits that you're doing are non-destructive. You can go back in the history at any time. So if I go look at this one, you'll see over here on the left, there's presets and history. Okay? So everything that I've done to this image is all there. So I can go back any step all the way to the beginning of the edits. Okay? Lightroom keeps that because it's non-destructive. So when I go to edit, it's applying those and saving the information on the edits inside the database. So the analogy that I like to use is it's like a cookbook. Okay, so when you are cooking supper, you have all your ingredients in the fridge and the cupboard or the pantry, but the recipe to make whatever it is you're making for supper is in the cookbook. Okay, so you get out the cookbook, you read the directions, and you apply that recipe to the food to make the ultimate dish. Okay, the same thing applies in Lightroom. So when you export, it's like doing a save as if you're used to working in Microsoft Word or something like that. When you export, it's saving as a new copy with the recipe that you've created inside of Lightroom applied to that image. So your original raw file or your original JPEG is still untouched on the hard drive, and it's going to save you a new copy with those edits applied. Okay? I hope that makes sense. If you have any questions about that, let me know. Let's see. I'm just going to take a quick look. Oh, lots of copies here. Yes, the video will be available later for viewing. I think Rob's answered that already. It'll always be available on the channel. I am using a Lightroom Classic, Richard. Okay, so you can see that up in the top corner here. If you're using Lightroom, which they now just call Lightroom, or it used to be called Lightroom CC, you'll see a very different editing panel. It's much sort of simplified. Okay, the idea behind Lightroom or Lightroom CC is that it's designed for people that are on the move and all your stuff is in the cloud. Okay, so all of my images, including these ones from you guys, are stored on my local hard drive. Okay, so you can see over here in the folders, and if I right click on any of them and say show in Finder, it's going to show me where they live on my hard drive. Okay, so these are locally stored on my hard drive. If you're working with Lightroom CC or just Lightroom, they're stored in the cloud. And the more images you have, the more space you need, and you end up paying Adobe a lot more. Okay, I think you get 1 terabyte for free, but if I look at my hard drive, I have 6 terabytes of space, which would end up costing me a lot of money, and it doesn't have as powerful of editing tools. If you are paying Adobe for the monthly subscription, you can actually have both Lightroom and Lightroom Classic, or you can switch if you find that you're not getting what you want out of that version. So I hope that answers your question, Richard. I want to hop over to Luminar directly now, and I'm going to use it as a standalone, and I'm going to show you what I did to this image. Okay, so remember a moment ago, we had this image that I couldn't make anything decent of, and I tried to play with it in Lightroom, and I wasn't able to get anything that looked remotely good, right? So I wanted to show you this one in Luminar because I was playing around with some templates, and I'll show you more of those right after the break. I was playing around with templates, and this one actually did a sky replacement, and I changed it to one that was dark and moody and really yellow, left it as a full silhouette, and you can see that this really yellow, sort of dark look works with this image. Okay, so what I did here was I've straightened it using the composition, right, because it was crooked, so I straightened it. And in Luminar, wherever there's this little dot next to the tools, you'll see that it's applied something in that tool. Okay, anything without a dot has not been applied. So I've applied a mood or a LUT here, and this was from the template that I applied. Okay, so if I turn that one off, you can see what it's doing. So the sky replacement itself was great, but once I applied this mood, it gave it this sort of film, cinema, you know, film noir sort of look, right? And this almost monochromatic orange and black look. And I think this really works for this image, right? So let's take a break here. I'm going to come back over here. If you have any questions, do please put them in the chat, and I will come back to you after the break. We're going to take a couple-minute break so that I can top up my coffee, and you can grab a beverage, go to the bathroom, and we'll be back in about 2 minutes or so. So while you are taking the break, do check out our Sky Pack on the website. I'll give you a link and also a coupon to get 25% off if you want to grab any of our Sky. I will see you shortly. Okay, I'm back. I'm just gonna go slow, and yes, I'm trying to be conscious of my microphone is over here. So if you have any questions, again, put them into the chat. If you're watching the replay of this later, post your questions in the description or comment area below the description. You can find links to all kinds of things on our website, including how to submit your images, the form to submit your images if you want me to work on some of yours next week. And subscribe to the channel and give us a thumbs up if you're enjoying this. I'd love to hear from you and tell me what you're learning today. I'd love to hear if you got some tips. If you've gone away with even one tip, I think that it's worth my time and worth your time. So I'd love to hear from you all. All right, let's get back to my Luminar. Okay, so I'm going to do a couple in Luminar because I mentioned templates, and there was a couple that I tried in here that worked really well. So I want to show you the before and after on this image first, and this one is from Rick. Okay, so it's a beautiful image to begin with, like a great mountain scene, really nice contrast and lighting, okay, coming from the side. Oops. There we go. Coming from the side, giving us some nice texture on the mountain, some nice puffy clouds. Okay, so let's look at the before image. Okay, so there's the image that I produced. Okay, and the before image was that. Okay, so all I really did was punch up that contrast a little bit. As I said, it's a really good original, right? And I've just punched it up a little bit to be more vibrant. And what I did here was, if you go into edit, Luminar has history as well. So if you want to see what I've done, you can look at the history, okay, or what you've done. You can look at your history all the way back to the original, okay. But I'm just going to go into the tools and reset it. So I've used a preset or a template, okay. So in Lightroom, they call them presets. In Luminar, they call them templates. They used to be called looks. In Photoshop, if you're doing something similar, it might be an action. Okay, all of these things are predetermined settings that apply to the image and do certain things. Okay, depending on the template or the look. Okay, or the preset. So with this one, what it's done is it's punched up the contrast and then I've edited it a little bit. Okay, so you can see that it's applied enhance. I've done some composition, structure. I'm not going to show you all of these. So I'm just going to reset to the original image and start in the templates. So up at the top here, Luminar AI gives you a suggested workflow. Okay, so up at the top, the first thing is you need to add some images. So if you don't have images in there, you need to add them. Okay, then you're going to be in the catalog where we were before and see your images. Okay, then the next thing it recommends is to go to the template module. So when you go to the template module, Luminar AI analyzes your photo and tries to suggest templates that it thinks are going to apply to this image and work well for this image. So let's take a look at what it's chosen. Okay, so for this photo, up at the top, these are the suggestions. Okay, so it's suggested easy landscapes, scenery, and artistic. Okay, so I think it's right on the money choosing easy landscapes because obviously this is a landscape. Okay, so the stuff going on underneath the hood, the AI does a really great job of knowing what's in the image. Okay, so then I'm just going to click on a few of these, and this is the one that I chose and ultimately went with, but we could go a totally different way, right? And as soon as you apply them, you see I click and it applies immediately. This image might work really well in black and white as well because it has some nice contrast, right? There's a soft color. Let's see what some of these other ones do. So literally with the template suggestions, I'm just taking a look and going through and seeing which one I think works the best. I could probably work with that one as well. Fast Fix is one I use a lot too, and you'll notice that it's saved in my favorites. Okay, so if you want to favorite one, just click the little heart. Okay. More Volume is another one that I use a fair bit. But you'll notice that it actually does a sky replacement, which I don't want to do in this case because the original sky is actually very good. So I'm going to stay away from that one. Right. So far, the ones that it's suggested actually do a pretty good job. Oh, and now it's suggested another one called Natural Skies. This one is nice as well. Let Luminar catch up. So it's a bit more blue. Oh, Crack of Dawn is nice. Okay, so one is a little blue and this one is a little bit more on the orange side. Okay, so I'm going fairly fast here and I'm not letting Luminar catch up to me. Let's take a look. Let's go with this one. Okay, so it's a different one than I did the first time, but let's start with this one. And then once you've chosen a template, okay, so you'll notice that I've favorited that one as well. Okay, if you want to see where your favorites are, okay, they're underneath where it says for this photo. So for this photo are the suggested ones. Your favorites are down here. So these are all ones that I've added into my list of ones that I use a lot. Okay, my templates are ones that I've edited. Okay, so these may have been ones that I started with the template and altered it and resaved it as a new one, or ones that I created myself. Any that you've purchased will show up here. Okay, and if you are a member of Luminar X, which is the monthly membership, now keep in mind that there's a lot of confusion around Luminar X. It does not mean that you are paying for the software every month. It means that you are paying for a membership. You get an insider forum that you're a member of, a group, and you get extra things like sky packs, textures, looks, things like that, augmented sky elements. Every month you get a couple of packs for your membership included. Right now, I think it's about $9 a month to be a member, and you get things that are worth far more than $9. So if you think you're going to want looks and sky packs and extras, sign up to be a member. Okay, Rob, maybe you can put our Luminar general link to send them to the website, to the Skylum website. So it's digitalphotomentor.com/Luminar-AI. Okay. If you have an older version of Luminar, such as Luminar 4 or 3 or even 2018, any of your older, what would have been called looks, will be saved here under legacy templates. Okay, some of them will still work and some may not. Okay, and then down below are all of the rest. So you'll see essentials, landscapes, and so on. Okay, so you can scroll through a whole bunch of different templates and look for one that may fit. I'm going to work on this one. Okay, so back up to the top here under Luminar AI's suggested workflow, we've gone from adding images from the catalog to templates. And you can see it's kind of a little arrow that's suggesting now you go to edit. Okay, so as Tom had in his question earlier about, thinking that Luminar AI is all about sky replacements, I'm not doing a sky replacement in this one. Okay, so you certainly don't have to. Remember I mentioned that sky enhancer earlier, okay, and this template has applied both accent AI and the sky enhancer. So if I take it farther, you'll see what that does. Okay, so it really looks for the sky and it's affecting the sky, but this is what I'm talking about going too far. You have to be really careful about overdoing it, okay, because it looks edited, it looks fake, and the sky is overly saturated now. Okay, so be careful with this one that you don't go too far. Okay. The next one I'm going to look at is composition AI. So again, it has some artificial intelligence built into Luminar AI, and that's why it's called that. So if you just push this button, composition AI right here, it's going to give you a suggested crop. Okay. What I find that normally happens is I like the crop 9 times out of 10, but I just have to move it around. Okay. So what it's done is it's taken some off both edges, but I actually want to take a bit more sky off. So I'm going to just bullet in a little bit more. Okay. So I think our main subject is really nice here. Okay. And I'm keeping the horizon down here, and you've got some really nice lines and things like that. Okay. So I might go a little bit more, or I could decide to go free and change the aspect ratio and keep it more panoramic, like so. But the suggested crop from Luminar was actually pretty good. You just have to move it around a bit. Okay, so already just before and after, just a quick template and a crop. And if you're happy with that, which looks pretty good, you're done in a couple of clicks. Okay, so it can be that simple. Okay, but if you want to do more, if you are the kind of person that wants more control of your editing, you do have things like a histogram here. So you can just show view, histogram. Okay, it's tiny, but you can still get the idea of what's clipping and not. Okay, so you can turn on those clipping notices. I'm going to go and apply some things like structure AI. Okay, so I'm going to take this to the extreme. The template has applied it partly, but you'll see what's happening is it's not doing very nice things in the sky, but it is doing nice things in the mountains. And I want to keep it off the foreground as well, because I want to keep my eye on the mountains. So I'm going to mask this one, and I'm going to use a gradient mask this time. Actually, I'm going to use a radial mask. So a radial mask allows me to draw a circle or stretch it. Okay. And let's make that a little bigger. Okay, so now it's applying to the outside of the circle, but I can invert it. Okay, so now it's applying to the mountains. And let's just apply the mask and see what it's doing. Okay, so you can see that it's applying just to this inner area. If I turn it off, wait for it to catch up. Turn it off. Okay, my computer is running very slow, guys, because I'm trying to run 2 photo editing softwares and stream video to YouTube. So my computer usually runs much faster. Okay, so now you can see when I turn it off, it's only applying to this area, right? If I want to mask it a little farther, I can do so with a paintbrush. And I can say, okay, I just want to erase. So that's the brush tool. That's the erase tool. And I want to get it off this sky area here. So I don't want the sky to have this effect applying on it. So wherever you see the red, the structure is applying. Okay? And maybe not so much down here in the trees either. So I really want to punch those mountains up. And then I'm going to just dial it back. So often when I'm doing my editing, I take it to the extreme so I can see where it's applying and then dial it back down. Okay, so that's punching the mountains up. And I might do the same with details. Let's see what color is doing. Okay, so color is a really great tool. Lightroom has the HSL panel as well. And what that stands for is hue, saturation, and luminance. Okay, so hue is like the tint. So if I pull the blue hue, I can take it from blue to purple or more of a cyan. So it's affecting only the tint of that particular color. Okay, so that's hue. I can do the saturation. I'll just do blue again. Okay, so it's only affecting that color. Or the luminance, which is brightness. Okay. Again, you have to be careful about taking any of these things too far. So I might want to darken the sky again, but keep in mind that if I do that, it's also going to darken the water. Okay, and there's a fix for that. I'll show you that in a moment. Okay, so if I want to darken the sky, I can, but just be careful it doesn't also overly saturate the sky. Okay, I actually want to darken this area here, and it's mostly, I'm going to guess, yellow and orange. So let's see what happens if I dial the yellow down. Okay, yes, that works well. So it's also affecting the grass over here. Okay, so keep in mind that as I dial this yellow down, it's affected the grass too, and I'll fix that too. Let's see what happens if I do orange. Okay, yes, that's pulling all the grass down. Okay, so it's doing a nice job over here, but I want to keep the highlights here, and I want to keep the highlights in the water. Okay, so once again, I'm going to mask, and I'm just going to erase it from this area. Okay, so I want to keep the grass here bright, but not over on the left. And I'm going to paint with a little bit less opacity, so I'm not darkening the water, because remember I'm darkening the blues. I lowered the luminosity of the blues. Now let's see what this tool is doing. So it should show that it's darkened the yellow and the color over here on the left, okay, which brings your eye back into the middle. And remember, we can always add a vignette. Okay, so the cool thing about the vignette, remember when I wanted to apply it to the birds off center in Lightroom, I had to use a radial filter. Inside of Luminar, their vignette actually is positionable. So the first thing I want to do is darken it. Okay, and this is my vignette trick. Dial feather all the way to 0. Then you can see the edge of it. Set your size, the roundness. Okay, and then you can position it. Okay, so I want this vignette a little more off-centered. So when I click choose subject, and then just click in the image, you can see that it moves around. So I want to darken this left corner even more. So I want to make sure that the vignette covers it. Okay, so I'm happy with the position. Now I just double click feather, put it back, maybe even a little stronger feather, and then adjust the darkness. Okay, so I don't want, remember, I don't want that. You want subtle. Okay, let's see what it's doing. So it's doing a nice job of darkening this edge over here. Perfect. A little more. So let's do a before and after again. Before. Okay, the only thing with this image is it's a little bit flat. You had a perfect exposure and you've got a raw file, so you've got lots of room to work with here to punch it up. Okay. This one's also had some toning, it looks like. Okay, toning is like split toning, so it allows you to adjust the shadows and the highlights separately. So I can see that the highlights have had sort of a yellow or orange tint applied, and the shadows have had, looks like a magenta tint. So let's see what happens if I turn that off. Okay, so you can see the original color of the image. It's very subtle, okay? So I can decide to leave that, or I can adjust the colors as well. This is the mood or LUT that's been applied with that template that I chose. Okay, so you can see what that does by turning it off. And it's also enhancing the contrast. Okay, so I like what that's doing. I'm going to leave those. Now you can see that it's applied that super contrast like I did before. Okay, so it's actually done exactly the same thing. It's brought the highlights down and punched up the midtones a bit. Okay. So just by looking at the things that the template has done, you can learn that way as well. So choose a template and then go look at the things that have the dot beside them and see what it's doing and how it affects your image. And then you will learn by sort of decomposing or deconstructing it, right? Think of like chef, deconstructing it. One of the other things that I use a lot, I might add a landscape filter here. Okay, so there's dehaze, golden hour, and foliage enhancer in this tool. Right? Dehaze is if you've got a horizon or a haze on the horizon, but I don't need to apply that. Golden hour gives you a really sort of like the sun is shining golden effect, but it's really picking up here, which I'm not sort of crazy about, so I'm not going to do that. Foliage enhancer will punch up the greens. Now you'll notice there's not a lot of green in here, and I usually edit this one to bring the hue more yellow, because this looks like a fall kind of scene where the grass is sort of brown, or it's a spring scene and it hasn't greened up yet. Okay, maybe a little bit of golden hour, just punch that a little bit. Okay, landscape I use a lot on this type of image. And lastly, mystical. Okay, this is under the creative tools. Mystical kind of gives you this glowy effect. Okay, if I take it all the way to extreme, that's obviously too much, but I'd love to use it around about 20, and it just sort of gives this softness to the image, right? I can choose to add some warmth in here. Another one that I use a lot to get that similar type of look is under glow, and that is an Orton effect. Okay, Orton effect is actually an old film effect where you shot slide film with one image in focus and one out of focus and sandwiched them together. So it's kind of creating a similar look. So I use Orton effect a fair bit. I do find that when I apply it though, it tends to brighten the image a fair bit. So that's where this brightness slider comes back in here and dial it down a little bit. And as with any of the tools inside of Luminar, I can brush them in or brush them out using this masking tool. Okay, so if I don't want the mountains to be as soft, maybe I just want this to apply to the clouds and the water, I can brush it off of the mountains. Okay, so let's just do that. Right, the other thing you can do is copy and paste a mask. So I'm just going to do this. Let's just take a little bit of that off of there. Okay, and maybe I want a little more sharpness in this area so that the eye wanders through the river. Okay, and I'm going to copy. There's a little 3 dots here. Copy. Okay, and then I can apply that mask to any of the other tools. So let's say I want to add some details and sharpening. Okay, so I'm going to sharpen. I'm going to add the details like I did before. Okay. So remember, small details will sharpen up the whole thing and you'll pick up a lot of grain. So I try and keep that one softer. Okay. But see, it's applied to the whole image. I'm on a mask and I'm going to copy in or paste in that mask. But what's going to happen is, remember, it's applying to everywhere except the mountains and this front. Okay, so if I push the / key, you can see where the mask is. If I want it to apply to the opposite, you just invert it, right? So that's that 3 dots again, invert, and now you can see that when I dial up these sliders, it's applying only to the part that's red, okay? So again, I don't want to go to extreme, just demonstrating for you. Okay, so it gives you a real fine control of where you can apply your sharpening, more so than you can even in Lightroom, because Lightroom gives you overall sharpening, or you can paint it in, but you don't have the same type of controls of small, medium, large details that you do in here. Okay, so that image is done. So we could have been done in 2 clicks, or you can take it farther. Okay, so now if you enjoy this template with the edits, you can just click down here on the right, this little 3 dots, and save it. Okay, so now it's saved it as Crack of Dawn Edit. Going back to your templates, you'll find that in here. So there it is, crack of dawn edit, and then you can rename it, okay, if you wish. Let me see, let's just call it sharpened, okay? Just like that. Let's take a look at another one that worked really well with the template, and that was this lighthouse image. Okay, so I'm going to do the same workflow. Once again, this is a raw file. This is from Anne-Marie, and I'm going to go to templates. And usually it takes a minute. If you see the Luminar logo up here on the left sort of looking like it's waving, it means that it's thinking, okay? So you can see that it's chosen these similar templates. I can't remember which one I used for this one. Oh, I do, yes. It was in here. So this has really dramatic clouds already in the image, so I don't want to write over them. I'm not going to do a sky replacement. I just want to enhance them, okay, because those clouds are great. Okay, that one works really well. And I think the Silken Skies, no, that's not that one. There was one that was called, I should write these things down. See, this is why you add them to your favorites, because I was playing with one earlier. Backlit clouds, that's the one. Okay, so now it's looked at overcast collection, so it's reanalyzed my image, knowing that it's overcast. Okay, and you'll see that I did add this one to my favorites, but look what it's doing. How great is that, right? It's added some tone, it's added some color. I think all I'm going to do to this image is add a little bit of a crop. So the composition AI, let's see what it suggests. And I'm done, because this one with the template and the one click, I agree with that crop as well. Okay, I'm going to keep the lighthouse sort of on the thirds, but maybe even less. So it's got less at the bottom, less at the right. I totally agree with that cropping. Okay, hit enter, and we could be done. I think I'm just going to add a vignette. Just dial it down a little bit. And I could probably dial these highlights down a little bit as well. Let's go in here. So anything to do with light, what you would see in the basic panel in Lightroom is under the light panel in here, and the highlight slider right there. Oh, look at that. Fabulous. Okay, so now we've taken that image from also sort of dull and drab to colorful and punchy. Now we could take it farther if you wanted to do things like getting into erasing some of these things like bird poop on the down on the side here. Okay, I would use the erase tool for that. I'll just show you a couple. So a couple of tips with the erase tool. I'm going to turn this guy off for a second. Is when you're dealing with the erase tool, pick the size of your brush, and you can do that here, okay? Or the bracket keys, square brackets. Pick a small thing first, okay? So don't go crazy and pick all of these. What I do is I will do a couple of these at a time, okay? And then click the erase button and let it try and fill it in, okay? Because it's analyzing all the information around it. If you've used content aware fill in Photoshop, that's basically what it's doing. So it's a fairly heavy edit to do, and the program is doing all of that automatically for you. And if you do too many spots at once, and let's say you choose 10 different spots and it gets 9 of them right, okay, you have to undo all of them, okay? My computer is catching up here. Let me just pop over and see if there's any questions. Let's see, how are we doing? So you said you did a similar edit, Rick. Awesome. Yeah, you just had to punch up the sharpening or punch up the contrast. So so now I've affirmed for you that you did a good job editing, right? Awesome. Okay. Any other questions, Rob, that I've missed? Holly says I've moved mountains. Awesome. Great. Okay, let's go back over here. Okay, so now it is applied and it's removed that spot and it's done a good job. Okay, so now I would just keep going and do a couple more. And I'd always do, like I said, a couple at a time. So if you want to remove all of that bird, poop from the side of the wall, do it little by little and let Luminar do its job on those, and then do the next ones. Because if it messes up, okay, it's not perfect. It tries to fill in what it thinks is there, okay? I'm going to try to make it do a bad job here. Okay, let's say I wanted to remove this garbage can. Okay, let's just see how it does. Okay, I'm going to paint in once my thing catches up here. Okay, so I'm going to paint in. Always do a little bit around the thing that you want to remove because it needs to see what's around it. It's going to analyze everything that you've highlighted. Okay, so let's see how it does in removing this garbage can. Okay, it might do a good job or it might do not a good job. Okay, and if it does not a good job, I'll just undo. But if I've done a whole bunch of spots at once, I can't undo as easily. Okay, I undo them all. Okay, it's thinking about it. Okay, so it did okay, like consider actually it did not bad. But let's say I don't like that version because it looks like the fence is not quite right. So just do Command or Control Z or Z, right, for Canadians and Americans. And that will just undo that and then clear the selection, right? So it's probably asking a bit too much, or I might want to do the top half and the bottom half separately. To apply your erase, just close the tool and it will apply those erases, right? So to do all of the stuff along the side there, it would take a bit of work, but it might clean it up and make it look a lot nicer, right? The other thing that I might apply again is that mystical filter, the one that I applied on the landscape, because it's going to give it again that real dreamy kind of look, right? Just like that. And I would probably be done with that. Okay, overall it's maybe a little bit light, so I'll just darken the whole thing a little bit. And I'm looking at my histogram to do that, okay? And I can check the blacks and the whites. I went a little too far. I can check the blacks and the whites. Now I don't have the same option of holding the Alt key in Luminar, but what I can do is hit J on the keyboard and it will show anything that's clipping. Okay, so it's activated these little triangles here. So if I pull the blacks all the way down, it should show you anything that's clipping in the black areas like that, okay? So if I want to do the same kind of thing and have just a little bit clipping, just hit J on your keyboard and dial the blacks down until you get that. Okay? So now I've gone really dark and moody. Okay, so same as the earlier sunset that I edited, we could keep this one light and airy or go dark and moody like it's a storm approaching. Okay, but this is a fantastic image. So I love this image. I think it's great. There's lots of potential here with some wonderful clouds. Now, if you see a sky like this, take one without the lighthouse in it. Okay, so start to build your own sky library because this is a wonderful sky. If you had a shot of just the sky without the lighthouse, right, like this part here, you would have a wonderful sky to use as a replacement. Right? All right, let's hop back over to Lightroom. So checking my... Can I say poop on YouTube? Well, I just did say poop, so there's that. Yes, we added the space shuttle. Okay, so going back to Lightroom, I've got a few more minutes in today's session. I wanted to talk about some images that I chose not to edit today, and I'll tell you why. Okay, there's a series here of images that I didn't edit. So remember I said I was going to give some tips about going back to the camera to shoot these things again. Okay, so this is one of them. So there's what I'm looking at in terms of images here is that there isn't a clearly defined subject. Okay, there's depth in this image in terms of foreground, something in the middle, and the haze off in the background. Okay, but there isn't one thing that my eye wants to land on as the subject. Okay, so I could edit this image, you know, until the cows come home, but it's not going to give you a subject. Okay, so you have to start with an image that has a clear subject in the beginning. Okay, same thing with this one. I could do things like correcting the tilt and punching up the contrast and bringing the highlights down and so on. But I really don't know what it is that you want me to look at as a creator. Okay, so think about these things when you're taking the images, right? Was it the pattern on the sidewalk that caught your attention? Okay, if so, all of the rest of this stuff is extraneous matter, okay? And I'm guessing here now, okay, this is Anne Treen's image. She's one of my tutoring students. But if this is what you were seeing was the pattern, just get a lot closer. Okay, so maybe even get down on the ground and photograph just the pattern. Or you want to find something like this, if it's because this is the part to me that's the most fascinating about this image here. Okay, so get down and photograph just that. Right, then I'm looking for something to still catch my eye. You know, maybe it's a piece of trash, or maybe it's a little bird, or something else. Okay, a dog, or anything that's going to break the pattern. Okay, so when you're shooting the images, keep in mind that you want to make sure that there is a clear subject for the viewer. Okay? So now I've made something that's sort of abstract, and I think that's a far more interesting image. Okay, so we could just go really abstract. Maybe we could even blur it out, right? Texture it out. Oops, texture, not blur. So I'm just lowering the texture and the clarity, and maybe just increase the warmth a little bit. Okay, but we can make it blue, we can make it yellow, we can make it whatever color we want. Okay, kind of interesting. Okay, so play with something like that, but get really clear when you're shooting as to ask yourself, why am I taking this image? What do I want people to see here? What do I want them to look at? And then when you review your image in the camera, make sure that that comes across in the image that you've taken. Okay. Similar issue with this one. Okay, so there's a lot of bright areas. Last week I showed you a little trick, and I'm going to do that here, of turning your image upside down. So when we look at an image upside down, okay, your eye is going to go to the areas that are attracting you naturally. Okay, so when you look at it right side up, especially if you've taken the image, you're going to go to the thing that you wanted people to see. Okay, but when you look at it upside down, your eye will go to the areas that attract your eye, okay, subconsciously. So where does your eye go here? I'd love to hear from you guys in the chat if you're seeing this. Okay, there's 4 things, okay? There's 4 things that draw your attention in an image, okay? So if anybody has watched my webinars in the past or seen me talk about this before, bonus points if you know what they are. Tell me in the chat, and I know there's a little bit of a delay between the live and the chat, so I'm just waiting for you guys. Anne says it goes to the lake. Okay, does it go to the lake, or does it go to this area of snow and ice right here? Okay, let me turn my little thing back on again. Let me turn my pointer on here. Okay, no, I don't want a slideshow. Okay, so does your eye go to the lake or this white area? Because my eye goes right there, and then my eye goes to the sky. Okay, and that's why I actually did lights out on Lightroom. So if you hit the L key, you can cycle through this, dim the lights, and full blackout, meaning that you just see the image with black around it. Then you're not distracted by the menus and all the stuff on the sides. Okay, so that's where my eye goes. So if I turn this back right side up, okay, you can eliminate some of those problems. You've got down the bottom, you've got a tiny bit of this walkway, but it's cropped out. So if you want to have the walkway show more of it. I think that would actually be helpful. But this white sky and all the stuff up here doesn't really add to the image at all. Okay, so your picture is really down in here, right? So consider if this is possibly your image. So really think about what is it that I'm photographing and get that in camera as best as possible. Okay. Here's another one that from Vivian that is, while its exposure is good, okay, so there's nothing really I can do here in terms of editing to make it better, because to me, the things that I want to do, I have to do in camera. Okay, so the things that are bothering me here as a commercial photographer who used to do product photography and this kind of thing is the arrangement of the actual necklace and the earrings. So the earrings here, showing the part that goes in your ear, sort of bothers me. I'd actually like to see them maybe up here, filling this space and turned around, but I can't do that in Lightroom. I could do it in Photoshop with a lot of work, but they're out of focus, okay? So I want to see them sharp and in a different place. So this one was photographed at f6.3. I don't know if you used a tripod or not, but using a tripod would help you get a smaller aperture like f11 or f16 to get more depth of field, because you're sort of bordering on macro here. Actually, Rob, if you put an article on our ultimate guide to macro photography, that might help as well in terms of depth of field for macro applying here. So what I would do with this image is actually think in terms of when you're shooting it again, what is the subject? Is it the necklace? Is it the earrings? Is it both? The background is okay, but it slightly takes away from the pearls, right? Maybe I kind of get the idea that it almost looks like ocean waves, which does sort of apply to the pearls, but I would arrange them more intentionally, okay? So a necklace like that, if you're doing a shot for a jewelry store, it has to be arranged perfectly, right? So have it stretched out or have it in a design, or you could possibly even have it on a person, right? Photographing on their neck and just showing their neck. So try and do things in the shooting process that make it a bit more clean and interesting if you're doing a product shot like this. Okay. Let's see, I've got one more. Also Vivian's, and I talked about this one last week, that again, this is more of a still life sort of product photography shot, more of an abstract eggshell. If I was doing a shot like this, I would probably crack several eggs, maybe a dozen. We'd end up having omelets for dinner, I guess, to look for the perfect shell. Okay, whenever you're doing something that's really close up like this, or food in particular, the items have to be perfect because you're photographing them so close up. So I see inside here, I see the egg has dried inside. Okay, so I would actually clean that out. I see the front of the eggshell is not in focus. And again, that goes back to depth of field with macro. Okay, so f5.5, you want a much smaller aperture to get the whole egg in focus and the reflection. Get a little bit more in front of the egg on the whatever, your plexiglass or something, and make sure it's clean. Okay, so there's lots of spots here that you could clone out in Lightroom, right? I can get rid of these, but it's a lot easier if you just clean the glass when you're shooting. Okay, so all of those things to take into consideration when you're photographing, right? But punching this one up just with the blacks and the whites, it gives it more contrast immediately, right? Like so. So the last one that I want to talk about is, again, no lack of subject. Okay, so this is from Annie, and I'm going to edit one of her other images. So this one has no subject. I don't know where to go with the eye. So even if I darken the clouds and give it a bit more contrast, right, there's nothing for me to land on as the subject. If there was a person sitting on a log or somebody walking on the beach, it needs a focal point. Okay, so I see that the clouds and the trees are making a sort of a similar shape. Okay, so if I was going to edit this image, I might actually do something like this and make it abstract and just focus on sort of the round shape of the trees and the round shape of the clouds and sort of punch that up. Okay, something like that. So let's move on back to editing. This one I did some editing on already. So I'll show you the before and after. Okay, so before, it was very similar to the one of Rick's I did in the mountain, where I just punched up the contrast, but I also cropped it a little bit. So it was that same issue of lots of foreground. So I got rid of the foreground and came up to see less of the sand. The other issue is I can only edit this so much, so I've made it far more interesting already. You could probably go into Luminar and add some color toning or things like that. But you want to look at time of day that you're photographing. Now, I don't know if this one's got the metadata on it. It should. It depends if they set their clock right. Okay, so according to this, it was taken on 1 p.m. Okay, so if your clock and your camera is correct, that's midday. So that's something that you actually want to avoid. Okay, so can you tell where the sun is coming from or where the light is coming from in this image? And I'm zooming in to 100% so that you can see the shadows. Okay, so literally the sun is coming from directly overhead because the shadow is under the branch. Okay, so where we had that that image of Rick's with the mountains, okay, where the light is coming across it. Okay, so this is the Lightroom version, not the edited version. Just keep that in mind. Okay, so where you have the light coming from the left here, skimming across the mountains, creating that texture. Rob, if you could please share an article on texture. There's one that we talk about texture, and another one on adding depth and dimension to your images. Okay, so when you have the light coming from overhead or from the camera, and that will happen with an on-camera flash as well, everything is very flatly lit. Okay, so there's no texture in the sand here being picked up because that all comes from cross lighting. Okay, so if you live near this place, Annie, if you can go back to this spot and photograph it again, just before sunset or just after sunrise, and you want to look for the light coming across the sand. But this is a great subject here, this tree and this sort of little mound of sand. You've got some great sky clouds happening. Just come back later in the day. So if sunset is, let's say, 6 p.m., okay, I'm not sure where you're from. If sunset is at 6 p.m., go back about 5 p.m. Okay, shoot into sunset and even after the sun goes down below the horizon, okay, and keep going so that you get more of that texture. Okay. Let's see. The last one I'm going to do is just show you. I'm going to save some of these for next week. I've got this one here from Meredy. I'm going to show you this one next week because you asked about keeping the feel of this fire and the haze. So we'll do that one next week, as well as this one from Sergio. We'll do this one next week as well. But I wanted to show you one from Blue Jay because he sent this one and I asked for the original. And he sent me a JPEG, which was out of camera. This one was edited. But I just wanted to show you sort of what's possible. So I took a very different approach with this image. And I actually decided to turn it into nighttime. Okay, so the original one looked like this. And I turned it into nighttime. Okay, so I've probably gone just a tiny bit too far with the darkness here. I'm going to bring up the whites a little bit. And let's keep our blacks dark. Okay, so I've applied a few things to do that. I've applied a radial filter here, which is applying that darkness on the edge. I've applied a radial filter here to lower these highlights. Because it's a JPEG, I couldn't get rid of that and keep detail here. So I've just darkened the highlights. And I used a adjustment brush to brighten, and I'm going to show you this here, this lamp. Okay, so the lamp was on, but it wasn't very bright. So I used an adjustment brush, exposure up to +3, highlights increased, whites increased, and lowered the clarity to give it a bit of glow. So see what that's doing. I'll just turn it off. Okay, so the lamp was on, but at night it would look much brighter. Okay, so it was just dull in the daytime. But see what I've done. Okay, so I've just turned the lamp on. I faked it. Okay, so I've increased the whites, the highlights, lowered the clarity, increased the sharpness. That's not what I want to do. Let's lower that. Okay, and also added a yellow color. I'll show you another little trick here. So when you go to add a color, you can choose anywhere on here. This is part of any of the local adjustment tools in Lightroom. So I can add a color, but if I want to add the same color that's in the lamp, I'll show you this little trick, okay? So you put your eyedropper over this little color palette. Click on the color palette and then go over to the image. So now I'm holding my mouse button down and you can see that as I move it around, it's picking that color over on the color palette, okay? So I want to choose that same yellow glow, okay? And then I'm just going to lower the saturation a bit. Okay, so a little trick to picking a color that's already in your image, okay? If I wanted to do something similar to the water, let's just zoom out here. So if I wanted to do something to the water, I'm going to add another mask tool. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to darken it. I'm just going to paint it in here. That's not a very good painting. Okay, so I'm just going to paint it in. And what I want to do is I want to paint with color, and then I'm going to show you how to mask this. Okay, so I'm painting darkness right now, but I want to paint color, okay? So I want that same color of the water to sort of be filled in. So I'm going to do my little eyedropper trick again. So see how as I move that around, it's changing the color of the water. Okay, now what color would the sky be if it was nighttime? It would be like dark blue, right? So I'm going to go somewhere over here and just lower that opacity, lower the saturation a little bit, keep the highlights down. Okay, then I'm going to apply this thing to just the bright part of the water. Because right now you can see that it's spilling over. Okay, if you click O on your keyboard, it will show you where you've brushed in. Okay, if you don't see it in green, Shift O will cycle through colors. Okay, I like the green because it shows up the best. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this range mask on. Okay, so this allows me to mask by luminance, okay, on this tool. So now it's showing me in red everything that I've brushed in, but I'm going to take it away from the shadows. Okay, so this range slider here is dark on the left, bright on the right, just like the histogram. So I want to take it off the dark, and you see what it's happening is it's taking it away from the reflection of the building, okay, up to there. Okay, and now I can see that I also want to get it off of the boat. Okay, so I'm just going to erase it from the boat. Okay, so my masking is complete. So I would probably zoom in and do a much better job of this because I want to apply to the water. Okay, and you can see what it's done. I've applied that color, and it's only applying in that area of the water. So I've gone from that to that, and you'll notice before I mentioned that I applied the vertical correction. So let me show you here. So now, normally when you're looking up at a building, the buildings converge at the top, but in this case, he's on a bridge looking down, so the buildings were converging the other way. Okay, so if I zoom in, you'll actually see how the bottom of the building looks like it's coming to a point, right? So if I just choose auto, it does a pretty good job of correcting that, right? And let's just get a little more of that, like that. So just to show you that you can do something really different with your images, you don't have to be stuck with what you've got. If you've got a JPEG that you shot years ago and you don't have a raw file, like the example that we did with this one earlier, and this one here, right? So if you've got a JPEG and not the raw file, think outside the box, you know, turn daytime into nighttime, turn sunset into the apocalypse like I did in that one of Rome, that kind of thing. So let me come back over here because I think we are just about done for the day. I'm going to do any final last questions. Is there anything that I missed, Rob? I need a new worksheet for Lightroom shortcuts. Okay, good to know, Anne. Thank you. Is the one that I have on the website outdated? Because I do have one. Rob, maybe you can share that if you can find it. We do have a Lightroom shortcuts PDF download. Yes, please, if you got value out of this live stream, please leave a comment on the video once the live stream is over. I'd love to hear from you, and tell me specifically, what did you learn today? If you're watching the replay, same question. Tell me, what did you learn? And remember, if you're new here, let me know that you're new so that I can welcome you. And I hope that you will come back again because we will do this again next week. I've got lots more images, but keep them coming. Keep submitting. And please send me some people images. I would love to edit some people images. If we don't get a lot of people ones, I can throw a couple of my own in there just to give you some examples. So thank you all for joining me. And until next week, I will see you again. Have a great rest of your weekend.